Okay, let's go ahead and admit.
Why is there?
All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the CalTPA Deep Dive for Cycle 1 for Year 4. Just a note, we are recording this session, so it will be on our YouTube channel for everyone's reference for that couldn't make it today. And we will go ahead and start with some introductions. I'm Zoltan Sarda. I am the consultant for performance assessment development, and I focus on the general ed CalTPA.
Good morning, I'm Cassandra Henderson. I'm also a consultant in performance assessment development, and I focus on the new early childhood CalTPA development.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Lori Thornley. I'm a program manager with Evaluation Systems, the CTC's technical contractor.
Okay. And I think this is you, Lori.
Before we get started, for those who may not know or who may be interested, today's webinar will be we will be paying attention particularly to Cycle 1. And if you haven't or don't have access to the Cycle 1 guide materials, they are available on the CTC exams website. And I'll go ahead and type that URL in the chat window in just a second. But if you navigate to the CalTPA faculty resource page and scroll down to the assessment materials section, there is a password protected zip file. And in that zip file are copies of all of the assessment guides and templates that candidates will use to submit their cycles. Those materials were revised recently on September 10th, and so the latest and greatest versions are available there. We'll want to make sure that we're using the most up-to-date materials with our candidates. And you can tell if you're using the latest version, it should read version 4.1 for the CalTPA Cycle 1 assessment guide.
And our agenda today, we have a full agenda for our time together. We're glad you're here. We just shared our welcome and introductions. We will talk about webinar norms. We will share the CalTPA Cycle 1 deep dive, where you will have a chance to see the instructions for each step and the rubrics. We'll have a short stretch break, and then we will share some tips for completing the CalTPA Cycle 1, how to access CalTPA assessment materials, we'll go over that, and some program supports that we offer to all of you.
And just some norms for our webinar. We've muted your microphone upon arrival, but if you're going to speak, please, we will ask you to unmute your microphone. We're going to use the chat feature to post questions, and we'll respond at the end of the presentation for things that we're not able to answer in the webinar. But at the end of each step in Cycle 1, we're going to pause for your questions as well. For a few minutes and answer specific questions for those steps. Any questions, we would like you to keep it focused on the CalTPA Cycle 1. If you have questions about your program, we have links and resources at the end for you to ask specific program questions. We ask that you avoid multitasking during the webinar to ensure that you hear everything that is presented. And we want to honor time for both participants and presenters by moderating participation. And then it's helpful to adjust your view to speaker view instead of gallery view. So that will allow you to better access the presentation. Okay. So again, just looking at the CalTPA structure. So we're going to look first at what the CalTPA structure is just for a moment or two, just to refresh our memories on that. And then we'll get deep into cycle 1 here and look at what cycle 1 for year 4. So again, both cycles are based on 2 instructional cycles here, and they both follow the same 4 steps. They both have plan, teach and assess, reflect, and apply. So, instructional cycle 1 is really focused on learning about students and planning instruction, and instructional cycle 2 is about assessment-driven instruction. And as we know as educators, this cycle of plan, teach and assess, reflect, and apply is really the gold standard for practice across disciplines. We also, as you again look into the guide, and we're going to reference this as we go through, we'll be guiding you through page by page on the guide. One of the things that we hear from programs and candidates is that the guide it has a lot of redundancy in it, and that's actually by design. So there are 3 ways that the process is outlined in the guide. So first, there's an overview that gives the big ideas about what they'll be doing in the 4 different steps. There's then an evidence table that outlines what the steps are and what the requirements are for each of those steps, and what the sources of evidence are. And then there's a step-by-step guide. Those are very redundant. It's really the same information, but presented in 3 different kind of formats. We really recommend that when you are working with candidates to really, first of all, look at that structure, how it's organized in terms of those 3 ways of presenting information, and then to really take it apart step by step, really look at what is each step asking to do, what are the sources of evidence that candidates need to submit, and again, looking carefully side by side, I think, lining up the steps along with the rubrics, along with the sources of evidence, so that they see how all 3 of those pieces are related. One of the things we see from candidates in office hours, that candidates that are often struggling, is that sometimes they'll look at the steps, or they're just looking at the templates that they're filling out, but they don't really look at the rubrics. Or maybe they're looking at the rubrics and they're not really looking carefully at what the steps are. So that idea of really encouraging candidates to look at all of these pieces side by side and simultaneously is very helpful for them.
Some more tips for introducing cycle 1. Inside the guide, you will notice periodically there will be some green call out boxes, and those add important details regarding candidate submissions and spend time discussing the contents. It is really important, and we see this in office hours a lot, that many candidates have not read the guide or even maybe skimmed it. So we really encourage them to read the guide. When they ask us questions in office hours, we pull out that guide and tell them what page they can find the information on, as in addition to just answering the question. Also, please introduce your candidates to the rubric scoring system by discussing the structure and the levels of the rubric, the essential question in the rubric. This is very important. The meaning of and versus or, and sometimes it will say and or, defining a construct, and reviewing the information in the footer, which shows what evidence the assessor will look at to score that particular rubric.
Okay, and I think one of the thing that's important when we're doing any kind of assessment is that to really understand what is the assessor looking for and what is the assessor's process. I think it's very helpful for candidates to really think about what is an assessor going to do with my work when they get it, and then go through that same process to check to make sure that there's the requirements are there and the evidence is there. So just a quick review. Here's how an assessor takes this. So the idea that we've got the rubric with the essential question, and really doing some work to understand what that essential question is asking. Second piece is that starting with level 3. So this is what an assessor does. Often in rubrics, other kinds of rubrics, we might look holistically at it, or we might look at level 1 and see if it's the evidence is there for level 1. But assessors start with level 3 because that is expected performance. That is solid expected performance. And then what the assessor does is they go through construct by construct, and they so on this one 1.1 there are 6 constructs, and they look for at least one piece of evidence for each of those constructs in the sources of evidence. And there's multiple sources of evidence for step 1. For rubric 1.1. If they find evidence for each of those 6 constructs in rubric 1.1, they will then move to level 4 and repeat that process. And so, looking straight at construct number 1, they find evidence, they do a 1-for-1 match, and then they'll go to construct 2, then they'll go to construct 3. And this is the work that candidates can do on their own submissions, but also in collaboration with others, looking at each other's work, following, giving feedback, basically following what an assessor does. So if there's if there's a construct that they can't find sufficient evidence for, what the assessor will do is they'll move from level 3 down to level 2, and they'll repeat that process. If they find evidence for all 3 of those constructs on rubric 1.1, then they'll score that a 2. So basically what they do is they keep going until they have evidence for each of the constructs on each level. I actually really think it's helpful for candidates to just go through this work, go through this process with their own work and with supporting others, their colleagues.
Can I add something, Zoltan, real quick?
Yes.
In addition to understanding this, how an assessor scores these submissions, this rubric work is really great for candidates also because in cycle 2, that cycle is very much about assessment and how they use that assessment in their instruction. And they have to create a rubric in that cycle and use it with children and go through that with them and show them how to self-assess. So this is just good instruction for them anyway.
So we're going to dive into CalTPA Cycle 1.
Step 1 is plan, the plan part of the cycle. And here we are, we're going into the guide. There we go. Here's the overview. This overview explains what the main focus of cycle 1 is. And it shows that, are you able to scroll down just a little bit, Lori? Thank you. There is the cycle graphic that shows plan, teach and assess, reflect and apply. Oh, one more thing. I'm sorry. Can we go back one more second, Lori? Just back a little bit. Thank you. Should have pointed this out. You'll notice some blue hyperlinks. Candidates can click on those and it will take them to the glossary for an explanation of what those terms mean. So those are very helpful. And just below this, here's one of those green call out boxes I was talking about in tips for cycle 1. This particular call out box explains what asset-based instruction is, what an asset-based approach is. Okay, as we look further down, it talks about UDL, Universal Design for Learning, the 3 key principles. Candidates do need to include that, the UDL principles in their instruction. And here's step 1 plan. It gives a general view of what they're going to be doing. Here it says they're going to gather information about their class, identify their content-specific learning goals. Now, Each cycle has to either be math or literacy. So if they choose math for cycle 1, then it would need to be a literacy focused lesson for cycle 2 or vice versa. Okay. And
if I could
oh,
jump in, Cassandra,
sure.
and that's for multiple subjects. That requirement is not in the single subject.
Sorry, yes, I should have said that. Thank you. English language development goals, ELD goals, for an English learner. But I want to make a point here that all students are English learners. Every single student, whether they speak another language or not. Also, it notes the California content standards and curriculum frameworks. Again, there's a blue hyperlink. You see those, and they can click on those. As we look further down the page, you see another green call out box. Those are extremely important. And as we scroll further down, I'm sorry, let me stop at step 1. I almost went too far.
Yeah. So Cassandra, we're still in the overview.
Yeah.
I can quickly take us just to look at it, make sure people know after the overview
Yes.
is the evidence table.
Perfect.
And then if we want
one more thing in here, let me just note something in here. This evidence table is often what I show candidates in office hours and what Zoltan shows them, because it's a nice view of what you need to actually submit. So on your left-hand side, it shows the cycle and the step and tells you what is provided. So it's right below that, it says, templates provided, including a sample lesson plan format. I want to make a note here. They are, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lori, they are allowed to use a different lesson plan format. However, they need to make sure they're covering everything that is requested of them to provide in the assessment. So I always recommend they use the lesson plan that's provided, just to make sure they don't miss any of the parts that are supposed to be included. In the middle, it says what they need to do for that step. And then on the far right, you'll see part A, B, C, and D. And those are the evidence that they're going to be submitting. So part A is a written narrative, getting to know your students. And it also has, right below that, it says getting to know your students. It says no more than 9 pages. So if their getting to know your students goes beyond 9 pages, the assessor stops reading at the end of page 9, that part A evidence. So it is important to stick to those page limits and to make sure they get the pertinent information within the right number of pages. Thanks, Lori.
Sure. And then now I'm going to take us to the actual detailed directions for step 1.
Okay, so here we go with step 1. These are the directions. You see, it tells them to choose one class of students as the focus for this cycle. They are instructed right here, because later on there will be some video recordings. They're instructed right here to make sure that they follow district guidelines to get permission to record students. And we'll talk more about videos as we go further along. But there's another green call out box. And then part 1 in step 1 is getting to know your students. In this section, the candidate's going to talk about their students. They're going to talk about their backgrounds. Hopefully they, outside of just talking with their students, they've looked at the students' information about them, some work samples, learned a bit about what their strengths and weaknesses are, what they enjoy. They share information about their family cultures, any other languages that are spoken at home. So they share getting to know their students and their class as a whole. Okay. Then whole class, they're going to describe students' assets and learning needs, English language proficiency, prior academic knowledge students have and skills they can already demonstrate, cultural and linguistic resources and funds of knowledge, okay, and prior experiences related to the content they're going to teach in this lesson. You'll notice another green call out box about standard English learners, and those are students for whom standard English is not native and whose home language differs in structure from standard and academic English, okay? Contextual information for the class, all of this grade level, age of students, content area, instructional setting, all of that information. Part 3, they're going to select 3 focus students and talk about their assets and learning needs. So focus student 1 is going to be an identified English learner. Again, all students are English learners. So you would start, a candidate would start with selecting a student for whom English is not their primary language. But if that is not represented in their classroom, they would choose another student who needs to work on English language development. Okay, and they need to post ELD goals. That is very important. They need to conclude those in their plan. Focus student 2 is going to be a student for whom there is an IEP or a 504 or even GATE, and it could be someone who maybe is in the process of possibly being identified or tested for those things as well. So that may or may not already be in place. Okay. Focus student 3 is the student that the candidate might wonder about. They may have experienced some trauma in or out of school. They may have had some difficult life circumstances. This might be a child who's been a victim of bullying, someone who's had illness, loss of parents, divorce, homelessness, poverty. So these are the children who basically need extra support, and the candidate's encouraged to anticipate that. Okay. Part 2 of step 1 plan is the lesson plan itself. It should include ELD goals for English learners. It's particularly for focus student 1. It should include what they're planning to teach. How will they know whether students have learned that content? And how are they going to structure the learning activities? If you could scroll down, please, Lori. Thank you. Okay. How do they plan to support the children in learning these activities? Learning the content, excuse me, thinking of ECE, sorry, and learning the content, particularly those students, those focus students we just talked about, who will need extra support and scaffolding. In part 3 of step 1 plan is the lesson plan rationale. What is the prior academic content knowledge these students have been exposed to? What are their assets and learning needs? What kinds of activities are they going to be doing? Instructional strategies the candidate's going to use. This is a very important one, and I noticed this missing in a lot of submissions, or not well fleshed out. Student grouping. Not just I'm going to work in group, have the students in groups of 3 or 4, but why? Explain the rationale as to why the students are grouped in that manner. Academic language development, and resources and materials that will be utilized. Okay. In addition, the candidate's going to talk about assessments they're going to use to check informal and formal, did they learn this material? Did they understand? And if we would scroll up just a little bit, Lori, please. Okay, there we go. Developmental considerations, and then focus students. Explain how it addressed the lesson addressed the needs of the focus students. Okay, and then part 4, they're going to talk about instructional resources and materials, and there is a definite page limit on this section. It is no more than 8 pages, where they discuss the books, the materials they're using, technology, all of that.
And then we're going to go down to the rubrics.
Oh,
Right.
sorry.
Okay, while you bring that up. So for step 1, and as you can see, I think all programs really work with candidates to do these processes in terms of lesson planning. And so we really encourage candidates and programs to think of this as an extension of what they're already doing. It's really a demonstration of what they're already doing in their coursework, in their programs, and in their student teaching. So again, in the guide, the essential questions for the rubrics are listed in a table here before the rubrics, but we will go down, and as you can see, for step 1 plan, there are 4 rubrics. We're just going to go briefly through what those rubrics are covering, and then we'll look at some guidelines as well. So again, for the step rubric 1.1 on planning, the question is, how does the candidate's proposed learning goals connect with students' prior knowledge? This is a key piece of step one. How do proposed learning activities, instructional strategies, and grouping strategies support, engage, and challenge all students to meet the learning goals? So those two key pieces, what are they doing to meet the, in terms of instruction, to meet the learning goals, and how are they connecting the learning to prior knowledge? We often see, and to prior learning, we often see candidates really not make that strong connection as how does this learning today fit in the sequence of what we've been doing in the past. Again, this rubric we've looked at this rubric in that earlier slide, but there are 6 constructs, and we again encouraging candidates to look at those 6 constructs, which in level 3 they're basically the essential question taken apart and put into separate constructs. Level 4 is a refinement on that on the essential question, and level 2 is that they've not quite met parts of that essential question. But level 3 is really what the essential question is. So again, that's rubric 1.1. If we scroll down, again, we can see the sources of evidence there, part A, B, C, and D for that rubric. That's where the assessors are going to look for evidence. We scroll down to the next one, 1.2. This rubric is focused on the planning for focus student 1. And again, the question is, how does the candidate plan instruction using knowledge of the English language learners' assets and learning needs to support meaningful engagement with the content-specific learning goals and ELD goals? So again, clearly defined content goals, clearly defined ELD goals, and how is that, what is the plan for supporting that English learner in learning the content and also developing their English language abilities as well. 3 constructs in the middle of that, and again, part A, B, and C, and D, anywhere in those 4 planning documents, the assessor can find evidence. Much the same as rubric 1.2, 1.3 is about focus student 2, the student with identified learning needs, and again, the question is basically the same as 1.2, is how is the instruction supporting student with an IEP, 504, or GATE plans or goals. And then if appropriate, if you'll see here, this student may also have ELD learning goals. So if this student is also designated as an English language learner, they would include ELD goals here for that student. And finally, the last rubric for plan is again looking at the plan for the student with academic or emotional support needs. So the essential question, how does the candidate plan instruction, again, using knowledge of FS3's assets and learning needs to support meaningful engagement with the content-specific learning goals and, if appropriate, ELD goals. And then we've added this piece and to address the student's well-being by creating a safe and positive learning environment during or outside of the lesson. So with that, these are the rubrics for step 1. And if we can go back to document. Okay.
So let's talk about some tips for success in step 1. This entire plan is asset-based. What are the assets of this class and these 3 focus students? So the candidate should write about this from an asset-based perspective. How is the lesson clearly built on these assets? For focus student 2, make sure they attend to the IEP, 504, or GATE goals. If focus student 2 does not have goals on their plan, the candidate should state that as they're writing about getting to know their students and writing about focus student 2. And the candidate should make sure the lesson plan has students engaged in higher order thinking. So, worksheets, lessons where the students are doing things that are very rote, that's not higher order thinking. They really want to engage students in higher order thinking skills. oops, sorry, chat popped up in front of my screen. The candidate should be specific about UDL strategies they use to plan the lesson and the rationale on why they're using them.
Okay. We are going to make this presentation available to you too, so you'll have all of these resources. Anybody who signed up for this webinar, we will be sending this out to you. But this is, again, just an overview. I think it's useful in thinking about the asset model of educational approaches for kids from marginalized populations, like that idea that there are unique strengths, passions, and interests that they bring to school, and that we can actually capitalize on and use and affirm and validate in our work with them. One of the things that we see in submissions is that candidates in the past have sort of written about things like what are their favorite TV shows, or what are the kinds of food they like. This, for year 4, there's a bit more emphasis on the idea of how is the culture and linguistic background of the students being brought in and affirmed and validated through the curriculum. So these are some ways of thinking about how can students' assets and cultural backgrounds be used as assets in the design of the learning. To the next one. And again, this quote has been added, or this statement has been added in year 4. So for level 4 on rubric 1.1, the candidate's lesson planning includes teaching practices that affirm and validate students' cultural backgrounds. So the idea that there's actually more sort of action being taken, this is a more active role in terms of integrating students' cultural backgrounds into the learning and seeing them as an asset for the student and as for the learning themselves. So this idea, I think one of the things that candidates need to continue to develop is this mindset of being an inquirer into the cultural context of both their individual students in their classroom and the community around the school. So it's the idea of what are some of the cultural traditions. I think a big question that we often look at is, what are the knowledge and skills that exist in the community and in individual families that may not traditionally be valued in schools? And how can that become part of the core curriculum? And then just that idea of what is the value of multilingualism? How can we not see that as something that we need to overcome and accommodate to, but actually add as a valuable piece to the instruction and the curriculum that's happening in the classroom?
And we would really encourage candidates and ask you to encourage candidates to be aware of barriers that exist to full engagement in the curriculum. In my family, I remember both of my children being asked to complete a family tree assignment and talk about how their ancestors immigrated to America. Well, our ancestors didn't immigrate here. And so it's important for candidates to really think about, as they're assigning things, does this allow all students access, or does this leave some people out?
Okay, with that, we'll take a few minutes to see. I see we've already had some questions in the chat. Thank you for those. If we could just pause for a moment, and if you have specific questions about step 1 in the chat, let's take a few minutes to look at those now and see if we can answer. Again, any program-specific questions, you can refer to this email address.
I don't see any new ones in the chat that you haven't already addressed. Okay.
I hope that means we've been clear. So, and again, if questions come up, please feel free to add those to the chat. Now we'll focus on step 2, teach and assess.
Okay, step 2, teach and assess. You can see the step at the top, and you can see that that step is broken down into its parts. Part 1 is for the candidate to select and annotate video clips. If we scroll down a bit, it talks about each clip and what needs to be shown in that clip. These clips are up to 5 minutes long, no longer. So if they are longer than that, the system will allow the candidate to upload it, but the assessor will stop watching each clip at the 5 minute mark. Okay. So the first one's creating a positive and safe learning environment for students, connecting to prior learning and establishing expectations for content-specific learning. Video clip 2 is about students' activities and instructional strategies. Again, no more than 5 minutes. Again, you see the blue hyperlinks that candidates can click on. And then for video clip 3 is next steps for students' content-specific learning. Again, no more than 5 minutes. And I'm going to pause a little bit longer on this one because candidates often will post in video clip 3, their next step for learning is tomorrow we'll complete this worksheet, or your next step for learning is to complete these practice problems. We're talking about next step for learning in terms of what we will study next and why, not just, in other words, giving an assignment doesn't meet that requirement of next steps for learning. There's another green call out box that gives important information about the video clips. And if we can scroll down a little bit, please. Candidates and students need to be visible in the video recordings. There need to be 2 or more students visible in the recording, and visible does not necessarily mean a student's face. If it's an online assignment, it would not just be an avatar or a picture. In the classroom or online, it could be a student's shoulder, a hand, the back of a head, just enough that we can tell it's a real human child. So it doesn't have to be a full-on face view of each child. There are annotations that the candidate needs to address in these video clips. And if we scroll down, we'll just scroll quickly through these. There are several annotations in the black bold print here. These annotations need to be addressed across all 3 videos, not within each video for all of them. I hope I'm saying that clearly.
Yeah, each annotation must be used at least once.
Yes.
They can be used more than once, but the requirement is only once.
Yes. Okay. At least once across all 3 videos. I just saw a question pop up. Yes. And again, as Lori said, they can be repeated, used more than once, but at least once across all 3 videos.
And this is an area I noticed that in the physical system where candidates are submitting, the system is configured so that a student cannot submit their this portion of their cycle unless they have done each annotation at least once. The system won't allow them to upload the video.
The recommendation here too is that they record their entire lesson and then select their clips. Also, the clips in and of itself, when they choose the clips, they cannot alter those clips, those independent clips. So they can't look as if they're altered or anything like that. But if they record the whole lesson, then they can select from that whole lesson what they want to submit.
And they do need to physically actually make those clips. We have students who will record a 20-minute lesson and then upload the same 20-minute video 3 times, thinking that they can annotate different portions, the first 5 minutes, the second 5 minutes, and the last 5 minutes. The problem with that strategy is assessors will only watch the first 5 minutes of a video. So if they upload the same video, same 20-minute video 3 times, the assessors are going to watch the first 5 minutes of that video 3 times. And so if a candidate is pointing out activity that's taking place in the second half of that video, the assessors will never see it.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, Mary. And if we scroll down a bit more. Oh, did you want to add something, Zoltan?
Oh, no, we're good.
Oh, okay. Evidence to be submitted. And that for this step, it's part E, the 3 annotated video clips, no more than 5 minutes each. And there's that is step 2. I keep wanting to keep going.
Okay, and now we'll go down to the rubrics. Again, you'll see the rubrics for step 2 that are listed in the table. There are 2 rubrics for cycle 1, step 2. And if we could scroll down. So the first one is focused around 2 things. One is, how does the candidate maintain a positive and safe learning environment that supports all students? And then how does the candidate support students in making connections between prior learning and the current lesson, and then also establishing clear learning expectations. So that can be found, evidence for that can be found in any of the videos. Typically we see it in video clip 1 because it's often the start of the lesson where the connection to prior learning happens. It's not a requirement that it's seen in that video clip, but typically if the video clips follow the sequence of the lesson, that's where it will be found. Again, 3 constructs for level 3 in terms of the rubrics. So rubric 1.6, and this is what Cassandra was talking about.
Sorry,
before.
can I add one quick thing?
Yes, yes.
You'll notice at the bottom of each of these rubrics for this step, the only evidence the assessor will look at is the annotated video clips. They cannot go back and look at parts A through D.
Absolutely, right. And then for this one, how does the candidate actively engage students in deep learning of content? And then monitor and informally assess their understanding. And then finally, the third piece, explain the next steps for learning. So the 3 constructs break those 3 parts of the central question apart. So we want to see deep learning happening, as Cassandra mentioned before, not rote learning, but work where they're using higher order thinking skills. We want to see candidates engaging in some sort of assessment and monitoring of the students' learning, and then closing the lesson with the next steps for learning. We're going to point this out, I think, again later, but we often see candidates who will say the next assignment or homework or the thing we're going to do after this that's not related to content-specific learning, next steps for content-specific learning. They really need to name, how does this, they started the lesson with saying, how does this activity relate to what we've already done and what we've already learned? And then we close it with, how does it relate to what's coming next and in the future? And again, as Cassandra pointed out, only the rubrics and annotations, or only the videos and annotations are viewed as evidence. Lori, thank you for juggling back and forth between the guide and the presentation.
Okay, some tips for success for step 2, teach and assess.
I see we have a question from Stephen
Oh,
in the chat, and if you like, I can address that one.
sure.
So I want to refer, the question is, are there videos that show the annotation process? And the answer is yes. They're not on YouTube. There are actually resources on the CalTPA website. Again, I've put that in the chat window, the CTC exams nessing.com website. That is the site for all California exams and performance assessments. But if you navigate to the CalTPA section on that website, under preparation materials, there are a number of resources under the section, I think it's called using the ePortfolio system. That's the system that the Pearson system that candidates use to upload their cycles. And in that section, there is a PDF guide to using the ePortfolio system that is step-by-step with screenshot images of what the system looks like and each of the different steps candidates have to go through to upload their materials. There is also a companion guide, PDF document with screenshots that show how the video annotation tool works. And thirdly, there is a video, I believe a 7-minute video that shows the video annotation tool in action. So those resources are all available on the CalTPA website, preparation materials page.
Thank you, Lori. Good question and good resources there. Okay, some tips for success for step 2. Video 1, be sure that the candidate sets the expectation for learning and for students' prior content knowledge and that it's clear on what will be learned in the lesson and how that builds on the content knowledge they already have, the students already have. For video 2, students should be engaged in higher order thinking. Please tell your candidates to avoid teacher-centered instruction where the teacher is doing all the talking. And for video 3, candidates should explain to students what they are going to learn next. And Zoltan just talked about how important it is. It's not just the an assignment that's given, you know, complete these problems at home and bring them back tomorrow, or whatever that they often say about assignments. That's not next steps for content specific learning. So the candidate needs to describe what content will be learned in the next lesson.
Okay, with that, we will stop for questions. And again, thank you for posting your questions as we go. Just at this point, are there any other questions about step 2?
I'm checking the chat.
I want to make one point. Cycle 1 focuses on the 3 focus students. The videos don't necessarily need to have those 3 focus students in them. That's been a confusion for candidates at times, because the instructions say, particularly for online settings, that they need to see 2 or more students in the videos, but then the candidates will often say, well, what does that mean for the 3rd one? You need to see 2 or more students, and you need to plan for the 3 focus students, but they do not necessarily need to be the ones that are seen on the screen, or on the video clips. So where does it say? So where does it say 2 or more students must be visible in the video? If it refers to students, plural, it's 2 or more. There's one video in cycle 2, which is the self-assessment video, which says that the candidate demonstrates the use of the self-assessment with students, more than 2, and has 1 or more student use the assessment. That's the only one where for part of it, we can see 1 student. That's part of that piece we were talking about doing a close read. There's the words and or, and then the word at least is 1. You know, we want to see at least, that means at least 1 version, or at least 2, whatever it is. And then the 3rd piece is the use of plurals or parenthetical plurals. So if it's parenthetical, it means 1 or more. Okay, if there's no other questions, let's skip on to step 3, which is reflect. There have been a few changes for year 4 in reflect to strengthen what we're asking for on the reflect cycle. Cassandra, do you want to do the overview? Okay.
Sure. So for step 3, part 1, and they're reflecting on what they learned, and they're answering these questions. How did getting to know the students' assets and learning needs, A, support the affirmation and validation of the students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds? How they want to talk about how that allowed students to access and engage with the literacy or math content. How effective was their instructional approach? And how effective were they in meeting the needs for focus student 1 in achieving ELD goals? And I always describe this to candidates as, you know, you have the pieces to the puzzle. You need to put those pieces together for the assessor. The assessor should not have to read and wonder what you meant or suppose what you meant. The candidate needs to be very clear in their reflection on answering each and every one of these questions with enough detail to make the points clear. If we scroll down, there's another call out box. This is important. It says, be sure to cite evidence from your submission from steps 1 and 2. The assessor is not going to look back at those steps, but the candidate can mention, you know, as I noted in step 1, you know, and give some information that pertains to this reflection, what they were doing with students. It's important to note that evidence because it shows that they were utilizing what they know as they plan this instruction. And this reflection shows what they've learned from what they saw during the instructional part of the video and when working with students. Okay, the evidence to be submitted here is a written narrative where they answer the reflection questions, no more than 3 pages.
Okay, and then we'll go to the rubrics. And again, for reflect, there's only one rubric. So this, we've strengthened the language in this one for year 4. What we found in the past was that the candidates would not, they would sort of, rather than reflecting, they would just sort of restate what was said in their plan or what happened during the lesson, and not really take a comparative stance about what happened in relation to what they had planned. So there's another key piece here is that we're really part of the rubric is that they have to cite evidence from steps 1 and 2 to support their reflection and their analysis. Often we would see candidates say, this is what, here's my reflection, but there wouldn't really be specific evidence on that. And so the idea is, how does the candidate reflect, citing evidence from steps 1 and or 2, the impact of their asset and needs-based lesson planning, teaching, and informal assessments of student learning, and analyze how effective, that's the new language, how effective the language was, or the lesson was in supporting the whole class and the 3 focus students in meeting the content specific learning goals. So we're really asking them to say, was this lesson effective? Was it not effective? To what degree was it effective, and why? And what's your evidence for saying that? That's the key for rubric 1.7. So we'll go back to tips.
So for step 3, we have some tips for success. Reflective writing is comparative in nature. And this has been an area, as Zoltan just mentioned, where a lot of candidates have struggled because they just restate. So what happened when the lesson was taught as compared to what you planned? What was effective? What was less effective? In order to write reflectively, the candidate has to look at evidence. So they need to cite evidence from steps 1 and 2 and use that evidence to explain their position. So for example, in part 1, I plan to connect the current lesson to the story we read in the previous lesson. In video clip 1, where I made that connection, several students had confusion about the character in that story. That's drawing in evidence from the earlier steps. That's explaining what they already knew, that they've already read a story in a previous lesson, and explaining how they plan to use that. It also shows what wasn't effective. So be specific, not general.
Okay, and I think we're going to stop. We've seen some questions here for the reflect.
One question I was trying to answer, and I ran out of time to respond in the chat. Is the teacher delivering instruction in part 1? It seems more like introducing the lesson.
And I just answered it.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Yeah, it can be an introductory lesson. Really, ideally, what we would see is a lesson that the teacher is more facilitating the learning rather than direct instruction. So, perhaps a mini lesson that gets the students engaged in some kind of collaborative work or discussion, and then the teacher is facilitating that work as they're doing it. It's actually not preferable to see a teacher doing direct instruction because there's less opportunity for higher order thinking happening in that kind of setting. It doesn't have it. The lesson could also be the lesson in the middle of a unit that they're doing. They could, they would explain what the context for that is in the context for learning. So what happened, this is a lesson, the 5th lesson in this unit that we're doing, and this is what the students have done before. This is how this lesson fits in the scheme of the whole unit. It does not have to be an introductory lesson.
Was that the question, Angel? Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Good questions today. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Okay, we are moving on to apply.
The last step, and you're still with us, and I applaud you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, step 4, apply. So in this step, the student is taking what they reflected on and applying it. What would you do? What will you do going forward with what the information you have now? So apply the application of what you learned. So and this is unique in that they have 2 options for responding in this section. They can choose to complete the written narrative and answer the questions that way, or they can record a short video of themselves, not to exceed 5 minutes, with themselves answering the prompts verbally. So that is an option there. And if we scroll down a bit, please, here are the questions. Based on your planning and reflecting, do you need to plan to reteach any part of this lesson? And they need to explain why or why not. How do they know that? They'll want to bring in evidence, cite evidence from steps 1, 2, and 3 to explain how they know that. When they teach the lesson again in the future, would they do the same thing or do something different and to improve higher order thinking, deep learning about the content, how and why, cite some evidence. If they were to develop and teach this lesson again, what would they do the same in regards to addressing those ELD goals and academic language? So they'll need to explain. And also in the next content specific lesson they plan for these students, how would they highlight or change the instruction to further validate cultural and linguistic backgrounds? Okay, so they need to make sure they address each and every one of those questions with some information as to why and how. And again, they have a choice in written narrative or a short up to 5-minute video clip of themselves answering verbally. That is the only evidence submitted, either the narrative or the video clip for this step.
Okay, and again, going to the rubric. Is a single rubric for this part.
And someone asked how many candidates choose the video clip. Not very many.
Yeah.
Not very many. Usually they choose the written narrative, but it is nice to offer an option for people who, you know, have a strength in a different area. Maybe writing is not, they're not as strong in writing and they prefer to answer verbally.
Yes, modeling differentiate, exactly. That's the intent here. And it's also interesting, you'll see in cycle 2 when they're submitting student examples of work, we encourage, you know, it could be a product, a process, or a performance. So they can submit videos or images of students, either the process, product, or their performance. So again, rubric 1.8 for apply, we're looking for candidates thinking about what they have learned in cycle 1 from steps 1, 2, and 3 about their students' learning strengths, and then how are they extending students' understanding of content and academic language development and determining their next steps for instruction. So they're not demonstrating this in a video, but what they're saying is, so as you know, from what I learned through doing this lesson, my students need additional support in this aspect of the work, or they are ready to be moving on into an extension of this or sort of more complexity of this. So they're really naming what those either supports or extensions are, citing evidence, and then explaining why. That's another thing that we see candidates not doing. Is like, why is this the appropriate next step for your learning based on the evidence that you're citing from steps 1, 2, and 3.
And just to add, what Zoltan said makes perfect sense about they often forget to explain the why. They really need to pull this together for the assessor. They need to explain their thinking. And I think sometimes candidates kind of maybe assume that an assessor will know what they mean. They should assume the assessor will not know what they mean and put the pieces of that puzzle together for the assessor.
Don't make the assessor do the work. You do the work for them. Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate your participation in the questions. Any questions about step 4? Hi, Gay, good to see you. Oh, Tips for success,
Okay.
sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Tips for success in step 4. Candidates should really use evidence of student learning to support their responses. Again, they need to be specific. Paint the picture for the assessor. Do not forget to include the content and act development. Citing. Oh, Lori, were you adding something? Did you want to add something?
No, I accidentally hit it twice. So you got
that's okay.
you got
Very
2
good.
tips. You got
That's
2
all right.
tips.
2 tips, 2 for 1. All right. Cite evidence from steps 1, 2, and 3, and be clear about how the next steps will strengthen content specific learning and academic language development. Not just what, but how. And remember that step 4 can be submitted either as a written narrative or a video explanation.
Okay. Questions here?
I'm going to check the chat and see if there are any new questions.
Okay. Again, we can continue with questions as we move through.
Zoltan,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, did you want to take the stretch break or do you want to continue forward?
With your permission, everybody, I think we'll continue forward, and if we can finish a little bit early, we'll do that. But I think, and we will. I think we're going into a section on tips for completing cycle 1. We've already given some, but there are some additional. Okay, so this slide is really focused on in the program guide, which is on the CTC website. We really encourage you to download the program guide. It's really a comprehensive look at what the CalTPA is asking for and the appropriate supports that programs can provide. There is a myth out there that I think comes from previous versions of either EdTPA or maybe even the CalTPA, that programs cannot provide direct support to candidates in this work. The CalTPA is not designed that way. It's designed to do is signal what strong teaching is. So strong teaching follows that that cycle of plan, teach and assess, reflect and apply. That's gold standard of strong teaching. Collaboration is also the gold standard of good teaching. And so we're wanting to really signal that this is a process that candidates should and are encouraged to follow, and that programs are encouraged to support with candidates. So again, consulting the acceptable support resource when you're working with your candidates, it has a long, extensive list of the kinds of things that can happen in the preliminary programs to support candidates. I think providing dedicated time for candidates to look at one another's draft submissions. We talked about that earlier. Have them step through each other's submissions like an assessor would. That helps them learn about their own work, and it's also supporting their peers. And then really schedule some of those coaching sessions. It's okay for programs and for supervising teachers, cooperating teachers, to provide feedback and support on lesson planning, and to provide feedback on writing. We often see one of the suggestions is to direct candidates to a writing support program at the program to support them with the writing. There is extensive writing for this, and being able to be clear in your writing is very helpful. Again, going to Cassandra's point, you want to make it easy for the assessor to read, and clear writing, and getting feedback on your writing from your peers and from others is useful for that. Let's see. Next.
And next, there we go. And some more tips for preparing and checking cycle 1. You can be creative with this. Provide opportunities for your candidates to apply rubric criteria to their own and or a peer's work, and to discuss that. Also, you can provide some locally designed reflection guides to foster their review. and ensure that each requirement's been addressed. It's very important that they address each and every part in each and every prompt.
Okay, again, tips for remediating cycle 1. If the submission is not strong, or if their submission comes back without a passing score, just some ways to think about it. It's difficult if your submission is not meeting the requirements. So really provide that space for emotional support for candidates. I know we all do that. That's in educators' DNA, is what is the learning, but also what is the well-being of our students. I think, and there's a question actually from Claudia, that piece of, would it be acceptable to support to tell a candidate that a particular clip does not show sufficient evidence? Actually, what I would do is I would ask the candidate, and this could be done in a group or with peers, look at the evidence that you have and look at the rubric, and you name whether you see the evidence. Have them step through that process, and it's perfectly fine for you to say that that doesn't look like strong evidence to me. And what might make that stronger? But I think getting them to be in that analytical phase around their own work is a way to go. But yes, saying I don't see the evidence, show me more is I think a good tack to take here.
Yeah. And Zoltan, there is actually on the CalTPA website faculty resource webpage an entire section on what is acceptable support.
Yes.
What can you do, and what you should not do. So I would direct folks to the website for that.
And really the key is that the submission needs to be the candidate's own work. When they're submitted, before they're scored, they are run through and Lori can speak more about this, they are run through a program that checks for duplications. You want to explain that a little bit, Lori?
The system checks submissions against all previously submitted submissions. So it's not an originality, a check against anything that's ever been written out there on the internet. It's an originality check of every submission against previously submitted submissions.
Okay. So with that, again, these are just some ideas. Again, encouraging peer review.
Oops, did I?
No, we're good. We
Okay.
have, in the next section, just in the interest of time, actually, we have a little bit of time. Maybe we can just step through this a little bit. Some of our candidates are still going to be in online settings. We will go quickly through this. And again, we're providing this PowerPoint as a resource for you as well, so you can refer back to it. But what are some of the guidelines for the online settings? Candidates still are required to complete the CalTPA regardless of their setting. Again, with the executive order, if they are not in a situation where they can complete that, that can be deferred and moved into their induction period of time, but they still need to complete the CalTPA. Online setting, just as in a classroom setting, it has to be synchronous. You have to see candidates interacting with students in real time, not them providing a lesson that then students do asynchronously. And then again, as with the classroom, it has to be continuous. The video clips cannot be edited, and then they're also based on California content standards. And again, really looking at what the cycle is requiring. So even in the online setting, all of those requirements for each of the steps need to be met.
Oops.
There's a question in the chat, if I can just jump in here since we just
Yes.
talked about this. that the question is, so if a candidate resubmits and some of their writing resembles what they wrote in the initial submission, will the plagiarism check flag that?
Good
Lori, can you-
question. Yeah, good question. Absolutely. It will flag, but all flag submissions are then reviewed by a human being. And a human being would realize that the candidate was being flagged against their own previous submission. So that should not ever cause a candidate to submission to be rejected.
So again, for working in online settings, candidates and students still need to be clearly seen in the video clips. And again, for all of them, in cycle 1, we need to see 2 or more. You can have some of the rest of the students can be covered or with an avatar in place as long as we see 2 or more students. They must be continuous and unedited. Blurring names is fine. It's not considered an edit. And again, that jumping from speaker to speaker, if you're in speaker view, that's not considered editing. That's the program that you're using doing that. It is not okay to block out students' pictures by the candidate. Like if students turn off their camera, that's one thing, but if the candidate is blocking students, that's considered editing. But if they blur their names, that's fine. And then candidates must adhere to all school or district guidelines recording in online settings, which may be different than the district's requirements for in-person settings. You want to take this one, Cassandra?
Sure. So some tips for working in online settings. A minimum of 3 students must engage in the lesson required for cycle 1. If only 3 students are engaged in the lesson, those 3 must represent the required 3 focus students. The getting to know your students template should indicate and briefly describe the online setting. And the lesson plan and lesson plan rationale template should address any changes made to instructional strategies or learning goals due to the online setting.
Okay. And again, here's some additional tip on the website. There are also additional tips for online settings, including just technology tips, how to set up your programs and that kind of thing.
Okay. All right, and just to reiterate, accessing the materials. Candidates have access to the materials once they register in the ePortfolio system. They have direct access to all of the materials. Faculty can access the materials on the CalTPA website, on the faculty resource page. Again, those are downloadable in password protected zip files, and I will go ahead and retype that password in the chat for anyone who didn't capture that earlier. The program guide that Zoltan was talking about earlier, that is a companion piece. It's a companion guide intended to assist faculty to be used side by side with the assessment guides, and it provides further information about the assessments and tips for working with your candidates, working through the cycles. Oops, and I got ahead of myself on my slides. Again, if you haven't taken a look at the program guide, I highly encourage you to go ahead and download that and review that, especially those of you who are face-to-face with candidates in your program. Go ahead, Zoltan.
And if I could add, make sure it's version 2.1. There's some additional information in there around the funds of knowledge and affirming and validating students' backgrounds. And
Yeah, all of the materials that are currently hosted on the website are the most current versions. So if you've downloaded any of the materials today or within the last couple of days, don't worry, you have the latest versions of everything. It's only for those who may have downloaded materials, last month or last year. You'll want to discard those and go ahead and get the latest versions. Again, the program guide, really, they're intended for everyone at your program, your deans, your faculty, your course instructors, and mentor master teachers as well, working with candidates. And there's no rule that says candidates can't download and read and use the program guide. They may find it helpful as well. All right, just as a reminder, we do have a submission deadline schedule. This schedule is posted on the website, on the CalTPA homepage. It just shows you there are numerous times throughout the year that candidates can expect to receive scores. A candidate can submit any day, anytime, 27 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days out of the year. What you need to understand is at specific points in time on specific submission dates, but for example, the first submission date, or we have a submission date coming up tomorrow, September 16th. Any submissions that come in by that date, candidates can expect to receive their scores on October 7th. If a candidate submits on September 17th, that's not a problem. It just means that their submission will be scored in the next batch, which closes on October 14th.
Okay, actually, we got a question from Claudia that just anticipated this slide here. So we do have weekly office hours, actually for candidate office hours, 4:15 to 5 p.m. We do have some faculty members that join those meetings. So if you would like to hear what the candidates are asking, that's perfectly fine for you to join those as well. So teacher induction office hours are first and third Thursdays at 9 to 9:45, and programs are first and third Thursdays, 10 to 10:30. We are scheduling 4 sessions for virtual think tanks for the 2021-22 school year. The first one, October 29th, 10 to 11 a.m. The focus will be on asset-based instruction. That's always a good topic for us to focus on. And then, actually, we did not change, I'm sorry, I did not change the quarterly coordinated reading on this slide deck. So we will get that. We'll update that information on the slide before we send it out to you.
CTC Online, we are famous. The commission has a YouTube channel. Please see that link, and you can click there, use that link to find information on webinars like this. There are other deep dives on there. There are, I believe, parts of our implementation conference might even be on there. But good information, good resources. And performance assessment has its own group of video supports. So there is a link for that as well. It's great for catching up on missed sessions and orienting new faculty members. And you can share the virtual think tank or VTT sessions with candidates. A lot of great information is shared there.
Okay, final Q&A, and maybe we can stop the share, Lori, to see if there are any final questions for anybody. Thank you all for sticking through this. I know this has been a sort of sit and get kind of session for you, but hope it's helpful.
If you have a question, feel free to unmute and ask.
Did you address the, I'm sorry, did you address the question in the chat about the if a candidate resubmits, right, and they adjust one section to boost their points, does that get flagged in terms of having been unoriginal, due to prior submission?
It would be flagged, but a person actually reviews all of the flagged submissions. So it would be caught at that point that it's a resubmission in the person's own work. The candidate's own work, sorry.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
I would imagine that that's most of that person's work is seeing resubmitted pieces. Any other questions? Thoughts?
I'll just
Okay.
throw in here real quick before people leave. Please encourage your candidates to come to office hours. Zoltan and I usually are there. We actually enjoy
And
seeing
Lori.
them. We enjoy talking with them. And Lori, sorry, I didn't mean to leave you out,
Yeah.
Lori.
No
We
worries.
enjoy talking with them. We go through the rubrics and how assessors score with them. We make sure we go through the sections of the guide if they have questions, and we encourage them to talk with each other while we help guide them too. So we love to see them. Please encourage them to come.
Yeah, we really developed a nice little community of learners last year with our frequent flyers. It was really nice. So
We're encouraging all of our, in our support program, we're encouraging all of our coaches to attend a minimum of 1 office hour with their.
good.
Oh, good.
Even if they don't have questions, just to get, like you said, just to join the culture. And it counts as an informal meeting, which I think is so awesome. So you should see
That's
more of us
wonderful.
anyhow.
Oh, that's good.
Wonderful. And a lot of people come and just listen. That's great.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time. I always
Thank you,
find this
Deborah.
so helpful.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And stop recording.
Oh, I will stop.
Zoltan, very nice job on the slides. They were really well organized and put together.